Hello everyone, Be Natural here, and welcome back to another WuWa video. Today, we'll be covering the kit, gameplay, builds, teams, and tech of one of the supposedly most difficult characters in the game, Calcharo. Okay, Calcharo, go with whatever you want, but just know that in Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, the first two syllables are kaka. Do with that information what you will. Now, I know there are many people that have been turned away from playing Calcharo because they believe he's too hard, or that in order to play him you need to learn tons of complicated tech. However, I actually believe that Calcharo is an approachable character that's well designed, both in terms of damage and difficulty of play. Okay, so I ultied, so I can just spam left click now, right? He has a low skill floor, meaning it's easy to approach the character and start having fun, but also has a high skill ceiling, meaning that as you continue to play and get more comfortable, you can start to slowly incorporate some advanced techniques to squeeze out even more damage. There are a lot of guides out there already for Calcharo, but many of them have outdated information, so I wanted to make an updated full guide to playing this extremely fun character. Calcharo's gameplay concept is actually pretty simple. By default, he has a 3-part gauge, and after ulting, it's replaced with a 5-part gauge. Either way, you basically want to fill his gauge, and once it's full, expend it to do big damage. When people refer to as high difficulty, it's because he has some tight timing windows, and maximizing his damage can be challenging. Don't worry, I'll go over this in more detail later. Calcharo's basic attacks are pretty standard and rarely used in his actual gameplay unless you need to get a few hits in for energy regen. His skill has 3 casts and deals moderate damage. There's a pretty generous window of about 5 seconds after each cast to use the next part, and you can perform any action in between. In addition, using the skill will not interrupt your basic attack combo. However, do note that if you swap off Calcharo before using all 3 casts, you will lose the rest of your skill uses. His skill is what you use to fill his default 3-part gauge, and each part of his skill will fill 1 part. When it's full, you can use your heavy attack to consume it and perform Mercy, an enhanced heavy attack that generates extra resonance and concerto energy. His Resonance Liberation, or ult, deals damage and lasts for about 10 seconds. Ulting replaces your normal 3-part gauge with a new 5-part gauge. Each part is filled by hitting an enemy with a basic attack, and when full, your next basic attack will automatically perform Death Messenger, which consumes all of your gauge to deal high damage. For some reason the game doesn't tell you this, but upon casting your ult, you start with full gauge, making your first attack a Death Messenger. When playing Calcharo, your goal should be to get 3 Death Messengers in his ult window, which you are given just barely enough time to do so. Calcharo's ult also increases his basic, heavy, and dodge counter attack damage for its duration, and enhances your next intro skill to do more damage. There's a mistranslation on the description of his ulti which states that you have to wait for his ult to end in order to get the enhanced intro skill, but you actually get it the moment you ult. His base intro skill is pretty standard when it comes to damage and animation speed. It's rarely used because you generally want to use the enhanced version of it from using his ult. Next is his outro skill, which summons a phantom to deal a surprisingly high damage 2-hit attack on swap. Finally, Calcharo's 2 inherent skills are Bloodshed Awaken, which increases your ult damage by 10% for 15 seconds upon casting Mercy, and Revenant Rush, which reduces damage taken by 15% for 5 seconds when hitting the enemy with Death Messenger. As far as leveling order goes, I suggest taking all of his nodes to 4 before starting to dump heavily into 1. After that, the prio should be his Forte Circuit, followed by his ult, then Resonance skill, then intro skill, and finally his basic attacks. For this section, the rotations assume you're using Tempest Mephis as your Echo, and Void Thunder as your Echo set, as it's the most common combination. Generally speaking, once you swap to Calcharo, your goal is to use your Echo, skill 3 times, and use your Enhanced Heavy. From there, if you have your ult, you'll go into the ult rotation, and if not, you'll swap off with outro and wait for the next cycle. However, with enough energy regen, around 20 to 40 range depending on how much swap canceling you do on your team, Calcharo will seldom have a cycle where he doesn't get to ult. This is because he generates about 50% energy while doing his ult rotation, and on his next pass, the start of the rotation will give him enough energy to ult. If you do have your ult, I've prepared 3 rotations that you can use depending on your comfort and experience level with Calcharo. Keep in mind that these are just some rotations that I recommend for general use with a focus on smooth looping, and there are a ton of other ways you can combine this kit based on your own setup. WuWa combat is very dynamic, and as you get more experience, you can modify the rotations to fit your specific situation or team comp. The most basic rotation I suggest is to start with your Tempest Echo, making sure you see the claw attack which grants you the 12% electro damage. Then, use your skill 3 times to build both your gauge and stack your Void Thunder set's 30% electro damage. Consume your gauge with Mercy, which gives you 10% ult damage thanks to his inherent skill. And with all 3 buffs active, you use your ult again and spam basic attacks until it ends. Once your ult is over, use your skill 3 more times to fill your gauge again, and then heavy attack to perform Mercy, and finally swap off with your outro skill. This rotation does have all the essentials, but there's a decent chance you won't be able to perform your 3rd Death Messenger if you have to do literally anything during your ult. To address this, you incorporate some tech. Playing Calcharo at a high level involves applying varying levels of animation cancelling. The 2 main ways this is applied are dodge cancelling and swap cancelling. Dodge cancelling is when you use your dodge to immediately interrupt and cancel the animation of attacks. However, you do lose any damage that would have occurred in the part of the animation you cut off. Swap cancelling is when you swap characters in the middle of some attacks or echoes, but unlike dodge cancelling, the attack's animation will continue even when you're on the next character. This means that for the duration of the animation of whatever attack you swapped off of, you'll have 2 characters attacking on the field and deal damage at the same time. In addition, you'll double dip on energy regen as both characters will gain energy from the swap cancelled attack. This can drastically increase the rate at which you regen energy, allowing you to fill your ult gauge very quickly. Used well, this can be a great boost to your team's damage output. However, some buffs such as character outro skill buffs are lost on swap cancel. In the game's beta, outro buffs were maintained for their full duration, but for the current live version of the game, you will lose these buffs if you swap off the character. Also note that only certain animations can be swap cancelled. Next, let's go over some Calcharo specific tech. Since you can perform actions in between Calcharo's skills, and it doesn't interrupt the basic attack cycle, you can weave basic attacks in between skill uses. This means that you can weave a basic attack after skill 1 and 2, which has the benefit of adding the damage and energy regenerations of basics 1 and 2. BA1 will animation cancel the end lag of skill 1, and only adds a total of 3 to 4 frames to the entire 3 skill combo. BA2 to 3 will also do the same, but their much longer startup animations make completing the combo take a lot longer. You can technically follow up skill 2 with a basic attack, but it doesn't really cancel any of the end animation. Because of this, my recommendation is to animation cancel skill 1 with BA1, and only follow skill 2 with BA2 and 3 if you need the energy regen. Once you become more comfortable with Calcharo and his rotation, it's highly recommended to animation cancel your BA3 and your ult. This is most commonly done by dodge cancelling towards the target after your BA3, but you can also use your skill to cancel as well. Whichever way you do it, you will lose a little bit of damage because this resets your attack chain, meaning you'll restart your chain to perform basic attack 1 and 2 instead of the stronger BA4 and 5. However, anti-canceling BA3 frees up some time during your ult, allowing you to fit 3 Death Messengers in your ult window more reliably, and is also safer and more recommended for most people. Since the animation time for Death Messenger is relatively long, it's one of the best candidates for a swap cancel during your ult rotation. Conceptually, it's pretty simple. You start Death Messenger, swap characters, perform an action, and then swap back in the time it takes for your Death Messenger's animation to finish. However, this is one of the most difficult techs to incorporate into Calcharo's gameplay. Because the time you have to fit 3 DMs in your ult is already tight, if you waste any time during the swap cancelling, you could miss the opportunity to perform your 3rd DM, which would be a massive damage loss. Make sure that if you go for this, you swap back to Calcharo immediately after you take your action. For most characters, an action would be a skill, echo, or ult, but be mindful that some ult animations last longer than the amount of time they freeze. You'll need to be careful that the action you're performing doesn't take too much time. When you perform a perfect dodge of an enemy's attack and follow it up with a basic attack, you'll perform a dodge counter. While in your ult, your dodge counter does not generate any parts of your gauge, which means playing out the animation could prevent you from getting the 3 Death Messengers off. To deal with this, it's recommended to use your dodge to animation cancel the dodge counter, and then continue on with your basic attack chain. Alternatively, you can just dodge twice so that the following attack is not a dodge counter. Finally, as an honorable mention, swap cancelling your echo is standard for many characters, but if you use Flautist, you will need to continue to hold the echo button even after swapping to continue the laser beam while acting on the next character. Alright, now that we've covered the relevant tech, we can incorporate it into our rotations. As mentioned before, you likely won't be able to get 3 DMs off using the basic rotation unless the boss is just sitting still for the duration of your ult. In reality, you'll likely need to dodge, move, or time a parry. To buy yourself some more time, the best tech is to incorporate dodge cancelling your basic attack 3 during your ult. Just as with before, start with your buff opener and then ult. Use your basic attack to perform Death Messenger, then use your basic attacks 1, 2, 3, and dodge cancel immediately after BA3. Follow your dodge with 2 more basic attacks, then use DM and repeat the basic attack dodge cancel, basic attack DM combo. Finally, just as before, finish with 3 skill uses and consume your gauge with Mercy, and swap out with your outro. This is what I suggest the majority of players aim for, as it's a great balance of damage, safety, and complexity. However, if you feel like you really want the challenge, or you're a taskbot disguised as a human being, you can incorporate Death Messenger swap cancels into any or all 3 of the DMs during the rotation as well. On paper, that looks something like this. You use your Echo, skill 3 times, so use Mercy, use your ult, Death Messenger, immediately swap cancel to the next character, perform an action, swap back, BA 1 through 3, use your dodge, BA 1 through 2, use your Death Messenger again, swap characters, perform another action, swap back, BA 1 through 3, dodge, BA 1 through 2, Death Messenger again, swap characters, perform an action, swap back, skill 3 times, Mercy, outro, and then swap. Be aware that depending on your teammates, you may have to perform different actions, and if your characters have their outro gauge filled, this can mess up your timing as well. Missing your 3rd Death Messenger will reduce your damage output for that cycle by 25 to 30%. For these reasons, I don't recommend going for this for general gameplay. Also, I'll go more into detail later, but I cannot stress this enough. If you are using YINLIN, do not swap cancel. Her buff is way too strong to lose. Now, these are just 3 rotations I've picked out as good bases to learn and expand from. You should make alterations to the exact execution of your ult and adapt it based on your situation. Additionally, you can change up what you do before and after your ult depending on your team and stats. For example, let's use my recommended rotation and make some adjustments. If you're pairing Calcharo with someone that has a strong outro buff like YINLIN or Jianshin, you might want to fit your full burst window inside that buff. To accomplish this, you can immediately ult after swapping to Calcharo. However, not performing any actions before your ult means you lose out on some of the buffs from your Echo, Mercy, and Set bonus. To remedy this, you can have a prep phase on Calcharo where you set up your buffs, swap to your sub DPS, and then swap back with your intro. To do this, start by prepping your sub DPSer's Calcharo gauge to 90%, Then swap to Calcharo, skill 3 times, use your echo, and swap back to your sub DPS. Fill the remaining Calcharo gauge and use your outro to swap back to Calcharo. After that, start Mercy and animation cancel with your ult. Then perform your standard ult rotation with BA3 animation cancels, and your final DM will have the effects of all 3 buffs. This works fine for the burst rotation itself, but what if you don't have enough energy to cycle your ult when you need it? Then you might consider adding some swap cancels from your sub DPS and support, or add 3 skills and Mercy before your outro following your ult. Of course, this is just an example, but you can see how various factors can affect what you add and remove from your rotation. Things like team comp, stats, FPS, and even ping are all factors that can change what you want to do while you're on the field. Finally, maximizing your burst rotation is important, but don't forget to consider how your rotation loops with your team so you can have smooth cycles. As with most standard characters, Calcharo sequences aren't that crazy. The majority of the damage increase comes from his S3, 4, and 6, which are all about a 9% damage increase from the previous tier. Although not a damage increase, his S1 is actually very nice for consistency, and worth considering since the extra 10 resonance energy every 20 seconds effectively reduces the energy required for your ult by 8%. There are differing opinions as to which weapon is best for him, but most agree that the top 2 options currently available are the 5-star weapons, Lustrous Razor and Verdant Summit. Of the 2, I recommend going with the standard banner's Lustrous Razor since the energy regen is very helpful, and the nature of our skill will allow us to have the full 21% liberation damage buff for every ult rotation. Jinxi's upcoming signature weapon, Ages of Harvest, does look appealing with the crit rate main stat, but is primarily geared towards heavy skill damage users. Since our skill damage only accounts for about 5% of our overall damage, I think the Lustrous Razor should still be the best. For 4-star weapons, the Battle Pass weapon Autumn Trace is a fantastic option. At rank 1, it'll outperform any non-5-star weapon, and at rank 5, its performance is pretty close to a 5-star. If you don't have any of the previous 3, you can always go with the craftable Broadblade number 41 and slowly rank it up over time. For set options, Calcharo can make use of 5-piece Void Thunder, 5-piece Lingering Tunes, and 2-piece Void plus 2-piece Lingering. 5-piece Void is the most common set and grants a 15% electro damage buff on heavy and skill use, stacking twice. You cannot get 2 stacks from your skills, which means that you must use both your heavy and skill to get the full 30%. 5-piece Lingering Tunes grants you a stacking attack buff, which is fully stacked after 6 seconds, as well as increasing your outro skill damage by 60%. Those using the 5-piece bonus should consider fitting their outro into the buff windows. Finally, the 2+2 setup just grants the 10% electro and 10% attack damage, but is completely non-conditional and also gives you a lot of flexibility when selecting echoes to equip. For main echoes, Tempest Mephis is the most common and recommended option for Void Thunder users, offering a 12% electro and heavy attack damage buff when connecting his final claw attack. Thundering Mephis is the other unique option to Void Thunder and offers a more fitting 12% electro and liberation damage buff on the last hit, but has an unfortunately long echo animation. In the past, there was a bug with the Phantom or shiny version of Thundering Mephis that granted you this buff on the first hit, but it has since been fixed. An option available to both sets is the Flautist, which deals decent damage when fully held, and also regens additional Concerto energy. If you do decide to go for the Flautist, just be mindful of your Concerto gauge and make sure you hold down the Echo button when performing swap cancels. Lingering Tunes Enjoyer should use Mech Abomination, which has a quick animation and grants 12% attack on cast. All 4 are viable, but I recommend going with Tempest or Mech Abomination unless you have an abnormally strong attachment to the Flautist. Regardless of the set you use, the main and substat priority doesn't change and you should use a 4-3-3-1-1 combination of echoes. For 4 costs, you'll take crit rate or damage depending on your stats. Your goal is to have a 1-to-2 rate to damage ratio, which you can check by going to your attributes page, subtracting 100 from your crit damage, and comparing the 2 numbers. For 3 costs, most people want to take 2 electro damage main stats, But if you rolled a lot of resonance liberation damage on your substats, you might find that having 1 attack percent nets you more damage. If you're struggling really hard to get energy regen, you can also use 1 ER main stat to tie you over until you get enough from substats. Finally, for 1 cost, the only option is to take attack percent. Calcharo's substat prio is similar to most DPSers with the exception of one thing. He really needs some energy regen, so if your substats are your first source of it, getting an energy regen substat roll is more important than getting crit. After that, crit rate and damage should really be on every echo, but if you have to pick one over the other, refer to the 1:2 ratio. Next, attack percent is followed by flat attack. For your 5th slot, you'll want to take energy regen until you're comfortable, usually around 25 to 40%, and the rest should be resonance liberation damage. I want to point out that while you can play him at 10 to 20% ER, I highly suggest getting at least 30% to give you some flexibility and breathing room in your rotation and cycles. To recap real quick, here are the sets you can use, the main echoes I recommend, the main stats you should go for, and the substat prio. For teammates, Calcharo really wants a sub DPSer that can buff his resonance liberation or electro damage, and a support that can offer any offensive buffs. Because of this, YINLIN is currently his best sub DPS, providing both a 20% electro damage amplify and a 25% resonance liberation damage boost on swap, lasting for 14 seconds. On top of that, she deals an impressive amount of damage both on and off the field, and can swap cancel effectively, making her the best sub DPS option by far. Her BA4, Skill, and Enhanced Heavy are all swap cancelable, allowing her to generate energy for Calcharo if needed. Again, really important, YINLIN's outro buff is so powerful that it is highly recommended not to swap off Calcharo while you have YINLIN's outro buff active. Since her buff only lasts for 14 seconds, and Calcharo's ult takes 11 to 12 seconds based on when you start the time for his last DM, you'll really want to be extra mindful of what you do immediately after swapping to Calcharo. An example rotation could be intro, into Mercy animation cancel ult, DM, BA 1 through 3, animation cancel with skill 1, BA 1 through 2, DM, BA 1 through 3, skill 2, BA 1 through 2, DM, and then outro. If you find setting up 3 stacks before your burst rotation to be tedious, an option would be to use 3 skills before your outro to set up for your next pass. Alternatively, it's perfectly fine to skip it since it's only a 10% additive damage buff. Alternative sub DPS options include Janshin for her 38% liberation damage amp, and Sanhua for her basic attack amp and quick animations, which are great for swap cancelling. For supports, Verena is the best by far due to her 15% all-type damage amp and 20% attack buff, but if you're using her on another team, Baichi can be slotted in as well to lesser effect. And that's everything I've got. While it's true that Calcharo has a lot of tech he can implement to maximize his damage, I really hope people aren't deterred from playing him because he's actually a very approachable character. His damage is still respectable even if you choose to use him with the simplest rotation, and incorporating his advanced techs makes him really fun to master. I hope this guide was helpful, and if you want to see more content like this, please consider subscribing since it helps me out a ton. If you've got any questions, feel free to drop it down below and I'll do my best to respond quickly. I hope you guys are having fun playing, and as always, good luck with your pulls.